Yeah, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the session and participating. My name's Cara, and in the room with you are Mario and Neil as well. So this session is all about Fuji, which is a tool for automatically assessing FAIR principles. It started out at the University of Bremen, where it was built for assessing data objects, and we've now extended it to look at research software as well. So we're going to start today with talking about FAIR and giving a demo of Fuji in its new extended state, followed by a bit of a discussion as well. You should all have links to the Google Doc for this session. If not, maybe Mario and you can post that as well in the chat. I don't actually have it open right now, there's too many screens. But there you will be able to find the more detailed agenda, some additional resources. You can add your name to the participant list if you'd like to do that. And we'll also use the Google Doc later on for the discussion. Oh, that changed. Okay, so FAIR Impact is the project within Fuji was developed. It's an EU-wide project all about the implementation of FAIR enabling practices, tools and services. And I've said the word FAIR a few times now. So just to get everyone on the same page, FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So ideally, we want digital objects to have all these properties. So for research software, that has been formulated in the FAIR principles for research software. So that means that the software and its metadata should be easy to find for both humans and machines. It should be retrievable via standardized protocols. That's the accessibility aspect of it. It should interoperate with other software through standards, so standardized APIs, for example. And it should be usable and reusable. In practice, these principles are further subdivided into sub-principles, but we won't go into that detail here. If you're interested, there's a link in the Google Doc leading to the publication from 2022. Or you can chat to Neil, who was a lead author in that publication as well. But these principles are great because they're easy to understand, but they're not directly actionable. So, like, what can I do that would make my software easy to find? Or when do I reach the point where my software is reusable? So that's when the metrics come in. So the FAIR Research Software Metrics, or FRSM, there's 17 of them. And they translate these principles into practical tests to measure the fairness of research software. And they do this by, so each metric is evaluated with respect to 3 compliance levels, namely essential, important, and useful. We do sometimes assign them numbers of 1 to 3. And the goal of these metrics is that you can evaluate your software against these metrics, and that will help you understand how fair your software is and how you can make it even easier for people to find, access, interact with, or reuse it. So you can find the metrics online. The same link is again in the Google Doc, but we'll also see them within Fuji in a minute. So Fuji is a way of automatically assessing these metrics. It's meant for guiding you through what is already working and what could be improved and how it might be improved. And also to just improve people's understanding of the relevance and the application of the FAIR4RS software principles. So I'm going to tab out of this, and hopefully the screen share will still work. So you should all be able to see a browser now. I'm just going to operate on that assumption, and if anything looks wrong, just shout. But this is a web client for Fuji. So there's a server running behind it, obviously with an API that you can query as well. And this is a very simple web client for it, so nothing fancy there. But we're just going to take this repository, which is our repository that contains all the changes that we made to Fuji in order to make it work for research software. I'm just going to take that link and paste that into Fuji and start the FAIR assessment. So what that's going to do is it's going to take a minute and ask GitHub for all the information
You just increase the screen size a little bit, Cara.
Yes,
We've yeah,
does that help?
yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Nice, thank you for pointing it out. Um, so yeah, what it's doing is it's going to GitHub and asking, what can you tell me about this repository? So it's retrieving metadata from GitHub, as well as just going through the files that this repository has. And that's why it's taking quite a bit, because it has to basically ask about all the files that are in all the folders in this repository. This was not taking quite as long when I wasn't on the Zoom call at the same time. I do have a backup. Ah, it worked. Great. So this is what you see then. And we can see that we've reached, this is a bit of summary, we've reached a score of 9%. That doesn't look great to start with, but bear with me for a minute. So here again, we find findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So the FAIR principles, and each of these are associated with a different maximum score, so to speak, because each of these have a different amount of tests. So we only have 2 tests for accessibility, so there's less score, I suppose, that you can reach. So just to point that out as well. So we can go down here, and this is the list of all the FAIR for research software metrics. And we're just going to go into FRSM 16, which asks, does the software metadata record include licensing information? And down here we can see 2 metric tests. So this is how this actually gets evaluated. So remember I talked about compliance level at the start. So this is demonstrated here in terms of maturity level. So they're used the same way. So maturity level of 1 corresponds to compliance level essential. Maturity level 3 corresponds to compliance level of useful. So in this case, we only have 2 tests. And the first one is the identifier or metadata record includes licensing and copyright information. And the second one then checks if that is in SPDX format. And so down here, we can see that some license information was found in a metadata. And in fact, what this does is it looked at, I'm going to increase this as well. So this is the repository, and GitHub has this little license tag in the sort of GitHub metadata here as well. And this is the bit that this test basically looked for and said, okay, I found license information in the metadata, and then it could check that the MIT license is in fact an SPDX license. For another example, we also have metric number 15. So this is about the software source code, including licensing information. So this is separate from the metadata. So if you look at the tests here, they look for the inclusion of a license file to begin with, for licensing information for bundled components, and again for the SPDX format. And in this case, we did find a license file, it's called license, and we found another file as well, which is actually a false positive. So this one is an API model for detecting licenses. But this is just the difference between these 2 metrics in terms of there should be metadata that has licensing information, but also the code itself should contain license information. You can see there's a little warning here as well about the second test because it's not implemented. And that is also the reason for a lot of these other grey question marks is these tests, if we open them up here, they are defined but not implemented for automatic assessment. But that's still useful because you could go and say, well, I can just read through these tests and think about, does my software comply with these? So for example, does it have a globally unique and persistent identifier? Well, you can just go through the tests and answer them sort of for yourself. It's not as ideal, obviously, as automatic assessment, but in this proof of concept implementation, we just didn't get around through all of these. One interesting one is, for example, for this one, FRSM 1 checks whether the identifier scheme is commonly used in the domain. And that brings us sort of to the second aspect of this mini workshop, which is domain-specific metrics for FAIR assessment. So if we go up here and click metric version, we have two different definitions of these metrics for FAIR for research software metrics. So the one that we've used so far is software agnostic, which means that it's domain agnostic. So it's formulated to mean something to every possible domain. But we also have a set that is defined by CESTA, that's the Consortium of European Social Science Data Archive, so social sciences is the domain here. And I've gone through the metrics and formulated tests that just make a bit more sense for them. So we're going to do that as well. But I have that prepared already because that is a big repository and it takes a lot of time. So this is a different repository. It's one of the CESTA repositories. And if we go back into our test or metric for license information in the software metadata record, we can see that we only have one test here, which actually looks for licensing information not in some metadata record, but specifically in the Zenodo record. And this test fails because it's not implemented, but that's just an example of the kind of differences that you can have for domain-specific metric test definitions. The same thing applies for metric 15. So here CESTA requires that licensing information should be part of the source code header as well, or that license file should be named license.txt and not just be anywhere in the repository. So there's a bit more, it's a bit more specific than the agnostic definitions. And another example is that it refers to Maven POM, which is a sort of build script that you can use because that makes sense for their domain. So they can specifically look at, there are specific texts in that build script that maybe wouldn't make sense for someone from, earth sciences. So there's scope here for defining practical tests that make sense for different disciplines. And that's what I would like to focus on in the discussion as well. So I'm going to try and get my slides back. That seems to have worked. So I wanted to zoom in on two of these metrics, metric number 5 and metric number 13. So number 5 looks at whether the software includes development metadata that helps define a status. So the idea here is that descriptive metadata helps support indexing, searching, and just discovering software. But there's a few questions around this metric, obviously, of what do we expect when we talk about development metadata? What does it look like? How can we recognize the status of a project? What kind of statuses can a project even have? So I would imagine there's not one way of structuring this type of data. So we would probably expect various different approaches, and some of these will be more common in some disciplines than others. And the other metric is metric number 13 that asks whether the software describes what is required to use it. So that one sounds more straightforward, but at the same time, requirements cover quite a wide range of things. So again, I thought that these two were just quite good examples of where domain-specific formulation might make sense. So to go into the first one in a bit more detail, the one about development metadata, again, we have a definition for just generic software repositories, so domain agnostic definition, and another one that is specifically for CESTA repositories. So just as an example, the generic tests check whether the software has any machine readable metadata associated with it that describes development and status. So specifically the tests look for contact information somewhere, or for metadata in a machine actionable format, so code meta or something. Whereas the CESTA method looks at the README and changelog files specifically and has very specific requirements about what needs to be included in those. So things like the version number, and the version numbering should follow a specific format. So very different focus in these two definitions, but both obviously associated with development metadata. And similarly for the metric about software requirements, the generic tests look for build and installation execution instructions somewhere in the repository. Again, that can be quite difficult to implement through automatic assessment because there are loads of places that you might want to look for these kinds of instructions: a wiki, read the docs, readme file, some other form of documentation, and also machine readable dependencies, automated build and installation tools. There's a wide range, so which do you check for? Whereas that's a bit more straightforward in the SESTA method, where they say that they look for dependencies and build instructions in the README, for linting checks in the build and test process using Jenkins, and for badges in the README file. So that's a lot more specific, but also would not cater to other domains that maybe don't use Jenkins as much. So I think we have enough people to maybe split up into 2 groups, so 1 for each metric, and have some discussion starting points, basically. So the idea here would be to find practical tests that would make sense for different domains, for automatically or even manually assessing these metrics, 5 and 13. So I think some good starting points can be what are good or bad examples that you've come across, what is the bare minimum to comply with one of these metrics, and ideally how would you go about checking these automatically with a tool like Fuji and implementing that. I think we'll have a hybrid discussion, at least in one of these groups. So ideally, I'd like you to appoint 1 remote facilitator in each of these groups. So that would be an in-person participant who would keep track of the chats and any raised hands, and also be a point of contact for remote participants so that they can just send them a message and say, I have trouble hearing person AB, can you please tell everyone to speak up, or something like that. Also, if in-person participants could join the Zoom breakout room, that can sometimes help just to have a bit more natural discussion. And yet, remote participants just let the others know when you can't hear or see or anything. The starting points are also in the Google Doc, so take notes there. And I would say we could maybe just try to meet back up in the main room, I'm guessing, at, let's say, 4:30, so that we have some time to just go through where everyone's discussion went. Yeah, are there any questions before we move on into the discussion?
Any questions in the room? I'm not seeing any hands raised online, and nothing in the Q&A. I guess one thing here where for the people who are in-room participants, one of the things we might want to do is check and see if we're able to join the Zoom room and not have microphone issues. So we might try and get it sorted into that. I'll open some breakout rooms.
I have those prepared.
Yeah.
I just wasn't quite sure what happens when I'm going to click the button, but I didn't test this. Okay, that didn't actually, yeah. Okay, you should all be able to join.
Should we have 3 breakout rooms? Is that right? One for all remote participants and then 2 more for people who are in the room? Or should we attempt to just do the people in the room as non-Zoom?
So I was hoping both to be hybrid. If we have, so because they're organized for both, sorry, the presentation is not reacting, for both metrics.
Okay.
But if you think it's too many people, then we can definitely split into 3 groups instead.
We have what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. We have 23 people in the room here.
Yeah, let's just do 3 groups then, and just everyone can talk about all the metrics. That seems like a lot of people for 2 groups.
Yeah. So how are you wanting to split this? Is this one online and then 2 in room?
Yeah,
Or
that sounds easier.
okay. In which case, I guess I can help facilitate the people who are on that side of the room. Mary can facilitate the people that's on this side of the room. And Cara, are you going to do the one online and then pop in if we have any questions?
Yes, just shoot me a message if there's anything, if anything comes up.
Lovely. All right. Could you quickly remove the breakout room part from the slides and put up the slide with the 2 metrics that we're going to discuss?
These ones.
Yeah.
Okay, so for online participants, I would just suggest that we go into the harm remove breakout rooms. So let's just use the one that is for metric number 5. That's named FRSMO5.
Do you want me to assign them across?
Sure. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you, probably. I can't really tell what's going on in the room in person, but we only have 5 minutes left. So I was hoping to maybe do a bit of a wrap up reflection here, what everyone's been up to.
Oh, I can just. Yeah. Hi, Cara. Sorry, I realized we didn't have the microphone. Yeah, how would you like to run this bit?
So just a quick summary, like we don't have much time, so maybe just like a few sentences from one person from each group. We can happily start us off with the online group, sort of saying what the main points raised were. So from our side, we didn't really go through the metrics in specifics, but there were some really nice takeaways in terms of what would be useful to test for, or what would be useful in terms of making. I'm guessing this aligns mostly with the metric about what is required to use software. An aspect of that is having, for example, a contributor's guide, because that allows you to reuse and adapt software, because it tells you how you can interact with the original developers, and then also deciding, when people decide whether or not to use software, a lot of things that I look for aren't actually whether there's information on how to reuse it, but it's actually looking at whether there's still active development happening, when the last update was, whether there's an issue tracker, things like that. Also do form part of making the decision of whether you want to reuse software. That's somehow an aspect of reusability as well, which I found was really interesting. But yeah, that's a quick summary from our discussion.
Because we were just at the point where I was asking if anyone wanted to report back when you kind of came back into the room, I can give a quick summary from our group as well. I think a lot of the discussion, we started off with the metric around development status, and I think most of the discussion was focused around different ways in which the people in our group looked for an understanding of whether a piece of software was at the right development status for them. And a lot of the things that have been discussed are all really good suggestions of indicators, but a lot of them are not necessarily directly connected with some of the metadata that is discussed in the metric. So there's a lot of other things that are more broadly around software quality, I think. And then we were just starting to get into the automatic testing and talking about what we were expecting from documentation and how we might go towards testing that. Because I think there were a number of times when the discussion turned to the documentation. The other bit, I guess, 2 other things to mention was there was a lot of kind of input from people into trying to understand what the metrics were about, how they came about, and where and how to interpret them. And then the other thing that we discussed was about the fact that different projects maybe at different levels of external usage, for instance, in which case you might be looking at them differently because what you're trying to use them for is different. Have I missed anything? I know I've missed lots of stuff, but have I missed anything important? Yep. Okay, and then I'm going to kind of pass across the other group.
So we didn't really stick to the agenda. We had a really interesting and very wide discussion about FAIR metrics assessment and automatic assessment, good or bad. Some negativity in the group. And we went on to discuss the metadata requirements as well. Some groups have got some really mature metadata, like the medics and everything else, but even then they tend to not. There is a group that's involved at generating the latest metadata, but not everybody's keeping up with it. We talked about how the metrics may be used and who they were targeted by, not the principles actually, and the metrics. We discussed the possibility that funders may actually use them to insist that the product that they're funding are fair. But if they do that, they'll do that at a very low level so that people can easily comply with it. And then how groups have got different levels of maturity in their metadata, like medicine and biology tend to be very mature. Other people don't know what metadata means, never mind being able to present stuff. So I'm afraid we went out of scope, but it was really interesting. But and I made a huge mistake in not assigning a scribe. I said I'll scribe and I'll chair, and I failed, possibly both. So, but it was really interesting. Do you agree or do you? Okay, I thought it was really interesting, but there you go. So not quite as good as your group.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much everyone for attending and for talking about the metrics. And don't worry about going off the agenda, Mario. That's absolutely fine. So yeah, I hope that was interesting. And there's lots of resources linked in the Google Doc as well, if you want to find out more. But yeah, that's all from me. Neil, any final words?
I guess the main thing, as Cara mentioned before, if you're interested in the FAIR principles for research software or the metrics that are being based off this, please do come and talk to me or send me an email. If you are interested in finding out a little bit more about the tool that Cara was demonstrating, Cara, what's the best way of doing this?
That would be going to I think I linked the Fuji repository from the Google Doc as well. If not, I will add that to the resources.
Yeah, oh, I see it is there. There is.
Or shoot me a message.
Yeah, there is a kind of like an openly a public version of it, but I can't remember whether the software metrics have been installed on the public version yet, but that's going to be coming relatively soon. So if you are interested in trying it out on your own repositories and finding out how you score, then you should be able to use that shortly. Okay. Any last words from people in the room? Any last words from people online? I can't see the chat from here. So if not,
Nothing in the chat.
Please do give Cara a big round of applause because she's the one who's put the session together.